진짜 예쁘다 이거.
네. 교류하면 되게 좋아요.
칭찬하시는 거예요?
저희 거.
Now, the only reason the FDA did that is because when we met with them was right after Seattle, where people were rioting on the streets saying these things were going to kill people.
Right.
So the same things that I've been doing for years had no impact. When there was enough craziness that there was all this brouhaha in the media, then they were able to sit down and the same technical things were able to happen.
Right.
So sometimes that's the way politics works. So I've always told people it's fine that Jeffrey's there. I think what he's doing is fine. It just doesn't have any real scientific credibility.
아니 마이클 한센 박사가 미국에서뿐만 아니라 전 세계의 GMO의 그 위험성에 대해서 알리는 대표적인 학자예요. 그러니까 한국은 지금 우리가 상당히 어떻게 보면 안전하게 지금 세미나를 하고 있지만 최근에 들은 소식에 의하면은 발전도상 국가에 가면 미국 대사관에서 그 사람 세미나에 가지 마라 이렇게 하고 말릴 정도로 그 GMO에 대해서는 가장 그러니까 소비자 쪽에서 가장 많은 자료를 가지고 소비자 쪽에서 얘기하는 대표적인 학자예요. 근데 그렇게는 소개를 지금 못하는 것 같아가지고 내가 좀 그래요. 그래서 어느 해에는 지금 3년 전인가는 그 GMO 이슈에 관해서 클릭을 해보면 이 마이클 한센 박사가 그 베스트 그러니까 클릭을 많이 당한 과학자 중에 한 사람이에요. GMO 이슈 하나만 가지고 베스트 뭐의 베스트가
최고라는 게 사실 다른 분들도 사실 더 잘하시는 분들도 계세요.
그러니까 나타난 우리가 얘기하는 것은 그걸 많이 알고 있어도 숨어 있는 사람은 아니고 그 나타나서 용감하게 이쪽 그 정보를 제공하는 대표적인 학자 중에 하나다 이렇게 볼 수 있는 거죠. 그러니까 왜냐하면 이제 인도에도 유명한 학자 한 사람이 있는데 초창기 한 1, 2년 이렇게 하다가 붙드는 데가 많으니까 계속 할 수가 없는 거예요. 그래서 이 양반 같은 경우는 자기 개인의 뜻도 그렇고 미국의 컨슈머스 유니언이라는 그 조직의 뒷받침도 있고 이제 지금 그런 거죠.
붙든다는 거 어떻게 붙드는 거예요?
네?
어떻게 붙든다는 거예요? 아니, 붙들어서 못한다고 하셨잖아요. 인도에 뭐.
붙들어서 뭐 무슨 얘기냐면 이제 대표적인 학자가 위험하지 않다고 소개를 하면 그 사람이 속한 단체, 정부 이렇게 해서 활동을 못하게 압력을 집어 넣는 거죠. 그건 뭐 다 아는 얘기지 뭐.
아니 어떤 식으로 구체적으로 어떤 식으로 압력을 하는 거예요? 그것까지만.
그걸 뭐 우리는 그 현장을 보지 못했으니까 그렇잖아. 어떻게 압력을 주면 난 압력 받았다는 얘기까지지 어떻게 압력을 받았다는 것은 우리는 되게 알 수가 없는 거지.
그런데 마이클 선생님도
아니 마이클 지금은 전혀 이렇게 포인트가 달리 가고 있어요. 지금 얘기가 무슨 얘기냐면 아니야 그건 어딘 걸 묻지 말고 그냥 이걸 안 쓰면 되니까 지금 이렇게 하는데 그 압력을 받았다 안 받았다 그것은 이거하고는 out of point.
(2012년) 말로 그 전 세계에 무려 1억 7천만 헥타르가 GMO로 재배되고 있다고 합니다. 우리나라에도 콩, 옥수수 이런 것들이 780만여 톤이 재배되고 있는 사료들이 가축에게 공급되고 가공식품 재료로 수입되고 있다고 합니다. 이런 때에 오늘 강연은 우리들에게 시사하는 바가 크리라 생각됩니다. 오늘은 오늘뿐만 아니고 농민단체들도 토종종자를 살리기 위해서 여러 가지로 힘쓰고 있습니다. 지난 8월에는 GMO 완전 표시들을 도입하기 위해서 이런 여러 단체들이 한살림이야 여성 중심생협 여러 단체들이 10만 서명 운동을 했습니다. 그리고 이런 한국의 상황과 연관지어서 미국의 GMO 대응 활동은 어떤지, 또 어떻게 표시제가 어떻게 추진되고 있는지 마이클 한센 박사님을 모시고 강연을 듣도록 하겠습니다. 마이클 한센 박사님은 미국 소비자연맹의 정책자문부서 수석연구원으로서 GMO, 광우병 등 식량 안전과 관련된 소비자연맹의 입장을 대변해온 이 분야의 권위자이십니다. 지난 2008년 광우병 파동이 있을 때도 한국을 방문하셨다고 합니다. 지금 그러면 마이클 한센 박사님을 모셔서 강연을 시작하도록 하겠습니다. 박수로 맞이하시겠습니다.
Thank you very much. I consider it very much of an honor to be speaking here for in front of the Global Social Economy Forum. I would like to thank them and also the members of the Happy Co-op for inviting me to come and give this talk. I've actually been to Korea a number of times, both on the mad cow issue and actually on labeling. I was first here in 1989, and I was told that 60 days after I was here, you had a mandatory labeling law. What I was asked to speak to is I'm going to talk about the status of the GMO movement on labeling in the US, and as a rough outline, before I do that, I think I need to let people know what what GMO crops and traits are in the US, and then I will also talk about quickly the policy of the US Food and Drug Administration on GMOs, because that's important to know. And then I will talk about, let's do this, about labeling campaigns. There's at the national level, so I'll talk about the Right to Know March and the Just Label It campaign. Then when we move to the states, there have been state labeling campaigns. I'll talk about Proposition 37 from California, and then labeling bills in Vermont, Connecticut, Maine, and then there's a ballot initiative going on right now in Washington State. Talk about those. Then for the anti-GM movement, we'll talk about market actions. That is things that have happened at Whole Foods, the campaign for GE, free seafood, and also there's a campaign on engineered apples. And then we'll talk about this most recent GMO pesticide and disclosure labeling law in Hawaii. So let's first talk about the major crops that are on the market in the US. The main traits is there's really only 3 of them. Herbicide tolerance, and that means that the crop has been engineered so you can spray a pesticide which kills weeds. That's called an herbicide. That's the vast majority of the acreage is in these herbicide-resistant crops. We also have insect-resistant crops. These are the BT crops. They produce a toxin from a soil bacteria. And then the third is for virus tolerance. Okay, those would be, there's a squash that's engineered to be resistant to various viruses. We have the papaya in Hawaii that's resistant to the papaya ring spot virus. But just the herbicide resistance and the BT, those 2 traits are responsible for about 99.5% of the acreage in the US. So let's look at what the main crops are. Soybeans, and this is all data from 2011. I've looked at the data from 2012, and it's about the same. Soybeans, 93% of the acreage of soybeans in the US are engineered, all herbicide resistant. Sugar beets, 95% are engineered, all herbicide resistant. This is all glyphosate or Roundup Ready resistance. Corn or maize, it's either BT or herbicide resistant, or the 2 of them together. That's on 88% of the corn is engineered. If we look at canola, 93%, again herbicide resistant. Cotton, which is both herbicide resistant and BT, is 94%. And people, they look at cotton and they'll say, but that's a crop for clothes, that's not a food crop. Well, actually, cotton seed oil, goes into margarine. And it turns out in the US about 8 pounds of cotton leaf trash get fed to dairy cattle every day. And then there's a papaya, there's a virus-tolerant papaya, the ring spot tolerant papaya. They're about 80% of the papaya in Hawaii. And as of 2005, there was a virus-tolerant squash or zucchini, that's about 13%. I've talked to scientists recently and it looks like that figure might be about 10% right now. So that's the major crops that are on the market. We now need to look at what the policy of the US Food and Drug Administration is, because in many parts of the world, people think that there's the impression that the US requires all this testing, and that couldn't be farther from the truth. In fact, the FDA's first statement of policy on genetic engineering in 1992 was actually introduced at a press conference at a biotechnology industry organization gathering by then Vice President Dan Quayle. It came out of the White House Office on Competitiveness, and it was introduced as a deregulatory initiative. And it was based on the notion that functionally there's no difference between genetic engineering and conventional breeding, and therefore they would be treated the same under the law, which means no requirement for safety assessment and also no labeling. So this means there's no requirement for human safety testing. There have been these voluntary safety consultations where the companies come in and they tell the agency what kind of tests they've done, and then at the end they get a letter which we'll look at. But there have been 97 of these voluntary safety consultations. And let's look at what actually happens. After the end of a voluntary safety consultation, the company gets a letter. I'm going to show you language from the letter that was sent to Monsanto. And this was about their first BT corn variety, Mon 810. And this letter was dated September 26, 1996. And the first key sentence is, quote, Monsanto submitted a summary assessment of corn containing transformation event Mon 810 on June 6. The important thing here is the words summary assessment. That is, they're not presenting all the raw data, just the summary, and you can't do a proper assessment unless you have all the data. But more importantly, there's this sentence. And this is the FDA speaking, quote, based on the safety and nutritional assessment you have conducted, it is our understanding that Monsanto has concluded that corn products derived from this new variety are not materially different in composition, safety, and other relevant parameters from corn currently on the market, and that the genetically modified corn does not raise issues that would require pre-market review or approval by the FDA. These two sentences are variations on them are found in all 97 consultation letters. Therefore, it's very clear that the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, does not require pre-market safety assessments, and they have not stated their own opinion about the safety of GE crops. They just say that the companies say that they're safe and that they don't require further testing. Now, if we look forward almost 10 years later, it turns out that the FDA functionally admitted they were wrong because there was this pre-market notice concerning bioengineered foods. And now look what the FDA is saying, quote, this is the FDA saying that before these crops come on the market, the companies now will have to submit some kind of data. And their reasoning was, because some recombinant DNA induced unintended changes are specific to a transformational event, e.g. those resulting from insertional mutagenesis, FDA believes it needs to be provided with information about foods from all separate transformational events, even when the agency has been provided with information about foods from rDNA-modified plants with the same intended trait and has had no questions about such foods. In contrast, the agency does not believe that it needs to receive information about foods from plants derived through narrow crosses. Right there is the FDA saying genetic engineering is different than conventional breeding. Because of this risk of insertional mutagenesis, we would want data on every separate transformational event. on. This is the FDA admitting there is a difference, yet they're acting right now based on the 1992 policy, not based on this policy. So let's now look for the campaigns for national labeling. There was it was called the Right to Know March, and it were people that marched from New York City to Washington, D.C. That is about 300 kilometers, and it took 16 days, and they were calling for federal labeling of GMO food and support for a GMO labeling petition. And this is just a picture of them outside of the White House on October 16th. This GMO labeling petition they were talking about came from Just Label It. Just Label It on October 4th of 2011. It was a coalition of 400 organizations. Today it's over 525 organizations. They submitted a citizen petition to the US FDA asking them to require labeling of genetically engineered foods. That petition was submitted on October 4th. By the time the docket closed at the FDA on March 27th, a record-setting 1.1 million people had written to the FDA in support of this citizen petition, and they had written to a specific docket number. Now, that was what was happening at the state, at the national level. At the state level last year, there was, in March 30th, 2012, these grassroots organizations submitted 971,126 signatures on a ballot initiative for the California Right to Know Genetically Engineered Food Act. Because they got all those citizen signatures by March 30th, that then became something that would be put on the ballot for the election that happened last year. That became what was known as Proposition 37. So, the yes on Proposition 37 was a coalition of organizations and businesses which support GMO food labeling. They rallied throughout California in support. And the way ballot initiatives work is there has to be a single individual that starts all this and submits it. And that individual was this grandmother, Pam Larry. So that was the yes side. On the opponent side, so on the yes on Proposition 37, our side spent $9.2 million. The top donors were Macola Health Resources. There's this individual, Kent Wheely, who's actually does a lot of, he's the person that founded the Seed Savers Exchange. Nature's Path Food, Dr. Bronner's Magical Soaps. And then the Organic Consumers Fund. That comes from the Organic Consumers Association, which is a grassroots organization of people. Now, so the yes side spent $9.2 million, and the no side spent $46 million. The top donors were Monsanto, followed by DuPont, followed by PepsiCo, followed by the Grocery Manufacturers Association of America. And you can see Monsanto spent $8.1 million US, DuPont $5.4 million, Pepsi $2.58 million, and all these others, the grocery manufacturers, Kraft Foods, BASF, Bayer Crop Science, Dow and Syngenta, they each put in $2 million. And what the results were was, if we look at this by November 7th of last year, Proposition 37 failed. Yes was 48.6, no was 51.4. That was actually pretty close. When you look at when this started, it was originally 62% in support, 20% against. And what happens is this no on Proposition 37, most of that 49 million was actually spent putting all these ads on TV, which were false, and saying how this was going to cause food prices to go up and how there were all these loopholes. And as soon as those negative ads started airing right here, the no side starts to jump up. They had money, so for the full month of October of last year, every single ad in California During the World Series, every other ad was against Proposition 37. Now, the yes side, they were only able to put ads on for the last 2 weeks. Once they did that, the numbers came back up. And if you look at people that voted on November 7th, if you just consider the people that voted on November 7th, Proposition 37 passed. The reason it failed was because all these people mailed in their ballots early in October when all they were hearing was the anti-side. So this was actually, given all the money spent against it, that was a very close, functionally 49 to 51%. Now, that, even though it failed, that energized the grassroots, and that led to this coalition called the Right to Know GMO campaign. And it's grassroots groups from all over the US. They were able to get 26 states to introduce GMO labeling bills. Now, most of the time, these bills don't even make it to a hearing before a committee. However, in a number of states, in Vermont, for example, on May 10th, the Vermont Right to Know Coalition were able to get the House of Representatives to pass this labeling bill, this House Bill 112, by a vote of 99 to 42. I, of course, went up and testified in support of this. They had me actually testify for an hour and a half. And that's the Vermont House celebrating the passage. This happened on May 10th, and then in the middle of June is when the session ends for the year. The Vermont legislature was not able to get the Senate time to vote on the bill. Their new session begins in January, and then the bill will be in the Senate. If it goes through the Senate, and there actually was enough votes last time, then it could be brought into law, signed into law. If we then look what the next state was in Connecticut, the GMO-free Connecticut, and this was with a large coalition of partners. They got the Connecticut House to pass GMO labeling by a bill of 134 to 3. And in the Senate, it was unanimous. This is the woman, Tara Parker Pope, Tara Cook Lightman, who is the head of the GMO-free Connecticut. And again, I helped them and testified in both the House and Senate. That was them speaking when the bill was passed, finally, on June 3rd of this year. So they became the first state to require labeling of GM foods. However, there's what are called trigger clauses. And this bill in Connecticut does not go into effect until 4 other states also pass labeling laws. But what's important here is in the state of Connecticut and many states, there had been labeling laws that had been introduced for the last 15 years. None of them ever made it to committee or out of committee. They did this year. And it seems like things had changed, because then we go up to Maine, and the Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners Association and other organizations, they got the Maine House of Representatives to pass their labeling bill by 141 to 1. And it was unanimous in the Senate. And on June 12th, then Maine became the second state to require labeling of GM foods. But again, there's a trigger clause. The bill will not go into effect until 4 other states also pass it. They have to be contiguous, which means they have to touch each other. And you can't really see it here, but if the lights were down, this is a picture from the Maine Senate. And what you see is all the names of the senators, and then there are these green lights, which means vote yes on this bill, and you see every single one of them are green. So we've now gotten these 2 states to pass it. And this is all sort of big news moving forward, because these bills have been around for 15 to 20 years, and they've gotten no movement. They are this year. Then the state of Washington, on June 29th of last year, there was the People's Right to Know Genetically Engineered Food Act, was filed with the Washington office of the Secretary of State. You then have to get, it needed to get 246,732 signatures of registered voters by January of this year. if they were able to get that, then it could go into the legislature or appear on the ballot. So this yes on, oops, it should be yes on 522, not 722. They got over 553,000 signatures, so almost double the number that they needed. So then what happened is, this is the yes on 522. Hearings were held in both the House and the Senate, but nothing happened, because what happens in Washington State is a ballot initiative, when it first appears, it goes to the legislature. And the legislature could pass it, then it becomes law, or they could modify it. If they modify it, then what would appear in the election would be the original ballot initiative, and then any modified one that the legislature would put out. So they held hearings, but there were no actual changes made. There was no votes. So that means that this was on the ballot for the election, which ended yesterday. And it's done by mail, so you have to mail them in. If we look on the yes side, this is data that came out 2 days ago, $7.7 million as of October 29th. And on the no side, 46 million. And again, if we see the top on the no side, Monsanto again, DuPont, Pioneer, Pepsi, Nestle's, and Coca-Cola. All fighting labeling. And on the yes side, again, it's Dr. Bronner's. The Center for Food Safety Action Fund, that's a non-governmental organization, the Center for Food Safety. The Organic Consumers Fund is the Organic Consumers Association. I actually, Consumers Union, for one of the first times, we did ads in support of I-522, so I'm actually in ads in the state. And on September 10th, this is before any of the ads aired, 66% of the voters said they probably or definitely will vote for I-522. By October, the no on I-522 ads begin. By October 25th, there are 2 polls with I-522 ahead, but by much smaller margins, either 45 to 38 or 46 to 42. What happened yesterday, we don't know. I've been in contact with those states. The initial mailings that have come in, which would be from 3 or 4 weeks ago, it's actually losing 55 to 45. But it was very close. I can tell you that the polling that was done in Washington State compared to California, there was actually higher support in Washington. They have a lot of folks out in the field, and we're not going to know, since the ballots had to be postmarked by yesterday, we're not going to know probably for 2 or 3 days whether that ballot initiative was successful or not. If it is, then labeling would have to commence in Washington State within a year or so. And the reason these fights are important is what we have done in the opposition is, in many of the different states, the definition of genetic engineering, the things that should be labeled, the exemptions, they're all the same. We're trying to make this the same because one of the arguments that the other side always uses is, you should do labeling at the federal level. We don't want to have a patchwork of 50 different states with 50 different legal requirements. Of course the industry is going to say that, because at the national level it's easier for them to stop something because there's fewer people that they have to buy off. Whereas if you have to buy off and spend all this money in all the various states, that could cost a lot. So what the companies do is what they say at the state level is, we're not against labeling, you should do this at the federal level. And then of course at the federal level they do everything they can to stop it. Now let's look, the other thing that the non-GM movement has tried to do is, there's legal maneuvers, there's also market actions. And there's this non-GMO project. There was a nonprofit organization. It was set up in 2007. And it was set up to develop a non-GMO label and to offer independent testing and verification of that label. It took them a number of years because everything was done open. They said, here's how we're going to plan to do this. They sought advice from others. And then in 2010, 3 years ago, this seal comes on the market. This is the non-GMO project verified seal. So when this is on an item, it means that, for example, if it has corn or soybeans in it, there's less than 0.9% of engineered, right? So this is something that is important on foods, and even more important, what happened in June of this year is the U.S. Department of Agriculture is responsible for all the labels that are on meat. So that means any company that wants to make even the most minor change on the label of a meat or poultry product, they have to get approval from the USDA. And the non-GMO project was able to get approval to use this label and to put it on meat and to put it on liquid egg products. And that would be that means that meat, if it's on a piece of beef or pork or anything, or chicken, would mean that it came from an animal that was not fed any engineered grain. So this is actually a very important step forward in the US, because as it turns out, labeling of meat is actually preempted. That's controlled by USDA. So even if the state were able to pass a law saying that all engineered meat should be labeled, that would actually be not constitutional because for meat the federal government preempts action by the local state governments. However, for plant foods, that's not the case, because the FDA technically doesn't have a policy on GMOs, right? Because they consider genetic engineering to be an extension of conventional breeding. So that's why states could label. So this was an important development, and if we look further, in the 3 years since that label has been on the market, it's now on more than 8,000 products, and those products have a market value of over $3.5 billion. This is a very fast-growing label. It basically went in 3 years from 0 products, $0 to 8,000 products, and a value of $3.25 billion, $3.5 billion. So that shows you that there's a market for these non-engineered products. And then also in March of this year, because of pressure from the activists, and also this was done because Whole Foods didn't put a lot of money into the California ballot initiative. What happened is Whole Foods, they're the largest retailer of natural and organic products in the US, and they announced that they're going to label all the food in their stores in the US and Canada as to their GMO status by 2018. So within 5 years, there's a chain called Chipotle that is just starting to do that now. Then there's also been this campaign on this engineered salmon. 3 years ago in September, the US Food and Drug Administration said these engineered salmon, that they're engineered to grow faster than conventional salmon, that they pose no safety issues. There were over 400,000 people wrote to the FDA at the time and said they disagreed. There was a poll that showed 78% of Americans believe FDA should not approve the engineered salmon. Then what happened this year is, well, on December 26th, the FDA put out their environmental assessment and said that these salmon pose no environmental risk. That means there was then a 90-day comment period. After the comment period was over, the FDA can look at those comments, and since they've already said there's not a food safety issue, they could technically approve the salmon. April 26th was when the date closed on the comments, and 1.8 million people submitted comments to this FDA docket opposing the approval of GMO salmon. Remember, with the labeling petition, there was a little over 1 million. But with this salmon, 1.8 million. And part of the reason for that is people in the US view animals differently than they do plants. They're more concerned when animals are manipulated and things are done to them than plants. That's why so many people commented. Then in March of this year, the campaign for GE Free Seafood. This is a coalition of more than 30 consumer, health, food safety, and fishing groups. They announced that major grocery retailers with over 2,000 stores will not sell GMO salmon if they're approved. That includes Trader Joe's with 367 stores, Aldi with 1,230 stores, and Whole Foods with 325. And by May 29th, Target, which has over 1,394 stores, plus other retailers, agree not to sell GMO salmon. So that means as on May 29th, there are 59 retailers with over 4,600 stores have agreed not to sell the salmon if it's approved. I just went on their website and it's now up to over 5,000 stores. So this is this campaign on the engineered salmon. And then before I finish with this, there was also a campaign on, there's an engineered apple that they're trying to get approved. It's called the Arctic apple. And what is it approved to do? It's an engineered apple that won't turn brown when you cut it open. Right? Normally when you cut an apple, if you have little slices of apple, if you leave them out, they turn brown. That's because of this oxidation process. You can put lemon juice or something on those and they won't turn brown. The idea behind this engineered apple is what it's really designed for is it's designed for McDonald's, because what McDonald's is doing is a healthier option is rather than French fries, you can get these little packets which have little pieces of apple in them. And so that they won't turn brown, they want to do this engineering process when you could literally simply use lemon on it. So there's been a campaign. There was letters sent to both Gerber, which does baby food, and to McDonald's, asking them, will you use this engineered apple if it comes on the market? This was a campaign that was spearheaded by Friends of the Earth, and we've signed on to this letter. The only reason I'm bringing this up now is because when I told the folks that I was in Friends of the Earth that I was here giving this talk in Korea, I got an email this morning, and it turns out yesterday they heard back from the letters that were sent to Gerber's and to McDonald's, and both Gerber's and McDonald's have said they have no intention of using this engineered apple. If it comes on the market, Gerber's has said we have no plans to use it in our baby food, and McDonald's has said we have no plans to use it in there. So these are the first two wins now, and that letter is going to now be going out to others. But I thought I would bring that up since it literally happened yesterday. Now, there's also been this Hawaii bill on GMO and pesticide disclosure. And what's unique about Hawaii is because of their climate, it turns out that many crops that are grown for seed, a lot of the seed production takes place in Hawaii. So there's a lot of growing of seeds, and there's also a lot of spraying of pesticides on these seeds. These are whether they're engineered or not. So the county of Kauai in June of this year introduced Bill 2493. That would require the disclosure of the growing of GMO crops, both the area, how big an area they are, and their exact location. It would require that to be made public. It would require any restricted use pesticides to all have to be made public in these areas, and there would be a 500-foot buffer zone that these pesticides could not be sprayed or could not be used within 500 feet of schools or other areas. This was considered a very big issue. A coalition called Pass the Bill, which was a broad coalition of moms, healthcare professionals, farmers, and civic leaders. They committed to passing this bill. One county in Hawaii, for their petition, they got 53,000 people in support of that petition. This is a rally that was held in September. It's the largest march in Kauai history in support of Bill 2491. People from the U.S. came and testified. Vandana Shiva came over from Europe, was all here. And what happened is on October 16th, after 19 hours of hearing into the middle of the night, the county, the the Kauai County Council passed Bill 2491 by a 6-to-1 vote. And that led to a lot of joy until a week ago, on October 31st, the mayor has vetoed that bill. We haven't heard what's going to happen. They would need at least 5 votes to override the mayor's veto. It's unclear whether that's going to happen. And so this is just some of the actions that I think have happened on the GE issue. This just gives you a little bit of a view of the state of the anti-GMO movement in the U.S. I'll say one further thing. I haven't talked about it, but there have been also these legal petitions that have been going into the government. For example, when they approved the sugar beets or the Roundup Ready alfalfa, the government would be sued by NGOs saying that they didn't follow the law. They didn't do a proper environmental impact statement before the sugar beets or before the alfalfa was released onto the market. And what happened in both those cases is the court would rule in favor, not of the government, but in favor of the opposition. And in fact, the case on the alfalfa went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And it was said that they could do that. So even though those actions have been happening, the government continues to lose. So what did they do? Well, what happened earlier this year is in our resolution for a funding bill to fund the whole government, what was sneaked into there was a little clause that people call the Monsanto Protection Act. And that was a clause that said that while that appropriation bill was in force, if there was a legal decision, for example, that said if a court decided that certain of these engineered crops couldn't be grown, right? This Monsanto Protection Act basically said it doesn't matter what a court says, farmers will still be able to plant this. So that was a provision that was basically a giveaway to Monsanto. When people realized that it was in there, there was outrage. But it went through with our budget resolution to continue to fund the government for another 6 months because we have a right-wing Tea Party that basically wants to destroy the federal government, and so they weren't going to fund it. And what happened is, this fall, it came up again last month, and they were going to put it in the continuing the resolution that just passed. Luckily, the Senate and all these folks stood up, so that Monsanto Protection Act is not in there. The other thing we hear that they're trying to do is they might try to introduce a bill at the federal level that would say that the states cannot pass mandatory labeling laws. So that's another thing that might happen, and there's been a lot of work on Capitol Hill to sort of stop these bills from being introduced. So I just tried to give you a snapshot of the movement in the US, and I just want you to know there's a whole other legal part that is ongoing. And I can tell you, even if I-522 fails in Washington State, that will not stop things. There's now been such an outpouring that the fight will go on into other states. And I think it's just a matter of time before labeling is required in the US. And I think the industry realizes that as well. That's why they're going all out on all this. And then the other thing we've seen in the United States is they're now trying to say that there is no debate anymore, that scientists all agree that GMOs are safe to eat, and that anybody that questions that scientific consensus is they've tried to say those of us that question that, they put us in the same category that people that deny climate change exist, people that deny evolution exist, which is sort of funny since I have a PhD in evolutionary biology. That's my training. Anyway, so what's happening in the US right now is they're literally in the press trying to say that there is no question about safety of GMO foods. They're all perfectly safe, and anybody that says differently is in the same view of people that do not believe in global warming, or that think that vaccines cause autism, or that don't believe in evolution. So the way I view this is this is sort of a reaction of the industry, because they see in some sense that they're losing, because I think it's only, as I said, a matter of time before various states pass these laws. And I will finally say, if I-522 does pass, there's some of us that are already working on an end game. As soon as one state passes a law, what's going to happen in the US is there will be a federal bill that will happen. So there's already some of us that are working on what that bill might look like and to try to argue what should be in it. So I do think that there will be an end game. I do think there will be labeling in the US. If it doesn't happen this year, it will happen within the next couple of years. And I guess I'll end there, and at the end take comments.
예, 강의 아주 잘 들었습니다. 저희도 아마 워싱턴주의 법안이 찬성으로 통과됐을 거라고 같이 기원해 봅니다. 지금까지 아주 열정적으로 강의해 주신 마이클 한센 박사님께 다시 한번 박수 보내드리겠습니다. 안내 말씀 잠깐 드리겠는데요. 혹시 질문 사항 있으시면 시간이 오늘 길지 않습니다. 4시 반까지 이 강의실이 허락돼서 질문 사항이 있으시면 이후에 좀 간략하게 정리를 바로 해주셔서 선착순 한 3-4분 정도로 시간 되면 바로 하도록 하겠습니다. 이후에는 토론 시간입니다. 전국 여성농민의 총연합 사무총장이자 GMO 반대 생명운동연대 집행위원장을 맡고 계신 김미경 위원장님께서 자리해 주시겠습니다. 박수로 맞이하시겠습니다.
우리나라에서 그 GMO에 대한 그 고민이나 활동을 하고 계신 단체나 개인이 굉장히 많은데, 제게 오늘 이렇게 발제를 할 시간을 주신 거는 가장 낮은 곳에서 가장 말없이 열심히 대안적 실천을 하고 있는 여성 농민들에게 기회를 주고 싶어서이지 않는가라는 생각이 듭니다. 그래서 오늘 행복정치생협과 한살리에서 함께 저희에게 기회를 만들어내서 대단히 감사하다는 말씀을 좀 드리고 싶습니다. 그리고 제가 이 사투리가 굉장히 심합니다. 짧은 시간에 빨리 말씀을 드려야 되는데 여러분들이 사투리가 심한데 말을 빨리 하면 알아들으실 수 있을까 걱정이 되기도 하고요. 자료를 최대한 참고해서 말씀드리도록 하겠습니다. 혹시나 이해하기 힘드시면 좀 질문을 좀 해주셔도, 개인적으로 따라 해주셔도 좋겠습니다. 그럼 발제를 하도록 하겠습니다. 일단 여성 농민들은 종자주권이나 식량주권을 위해서 토종종자를 지키고 있는데, 몬산토를 비롯한 초국적 기업들은 GMO가 세계 식량 위기를 해결할 거라고 했습니다. 근데 그것이 실제로 현실로는 그렇게 나타나지 않고 있습니다. 오히려 더 많은 생산비를 농민들한테 부과하면서 농민들이 더 이상 농사를 지을 수 없도록 농지에서 몰아내고 있습니다. 그리고 소비자들에게는 알 권리를 박탈하고 있습니다. 그리고 자연과 생태계는 또 오염이 되고 있고, 우리 모두 어느 누구도 GMO로부터 사실은 자유로울 수 있는가 고민을 하고 있습니다. 보시면 96년도 저희가 GMO를 수입하면서 2012년도까지 계속 수입이 늘어나고 있다는 이야기를 좀 드려야 되겠습니다. 96년도는 몬산토가 GMO를 개발해서 수출을 하기 시작한 그때부터 저희가 수입을 했는데, 2012년도에는 식용과 사료동에서 이렇게 7가지, 5가지로 늘어나고 있습니다. 수입량 계속 늘어나고 있다는 표이고 자료를 참고해 주시면 될 것 같습니다. 우리나라에서 사실은 생산이 허용이 되고 있지는 않지만 시험재배는 계속 늘어나고 있습니다. 대학을 중심으로 저희가 생산하지도 않을 것을 왜 자꾸 시험재배를 하고 있느냐 했을 때는 말이 되지 않는 답변이 돌아옵니다. 이것은 설사 시험재배를 통해서 생산이 된다 하더라도 국내 식반을 할 것이 아니라 해외 수출용이다. 그런 이야기를 하는데 사실은 그것은 우리 이때까지 경험을 볼 때 그런 경우는 잘 없었죠. 그래서 이렇게 시험 대비를 열심히 하고 있다는 것은 국내에서도 반드시 시판이 될 것이라는 우려를 하고 있습니다. GMO가 수입이 계속 늘어나고 시험 재배가 이렇게 늘어나면서 유출에 대한 고민들이 계속되고 있습니다. 특히 저희 생산자들은 현장에서 토종종자를 지키고 농사를 직접 짓고 있는 입장이기 때문에 유출에 대한 고민을 굉장히 많이 하고 있습니다. 이것은 올해 발표된 내용입니다. GMO가 몇 년 동안 2009년도 이후에 계속 유출 지역이 늘어나고 있고 그 면적이 점점 확대되고 있다라고 하고 있고 저희 여성 농민들이 실제로 토종종자를 지켜내면서 식량주권을 지키기 위해서 노력하고 있는 지역에서도 유출이 되고 있습니다. 그래서 저희들은 오염에 대한 고민을 심각하게 사실 하고 있고 그래서 토종종자를 지키고 있는 영광, 제주, 음성, 횡성, 원주 이런 지역에서 굉장히 여성농민들이 고민이 많습니다. 그래서 그 지자체에 저희들이 민원 청구를 해놨습니다. 우리는 토종종자를 지키고자 하고 우리 안전한 먹거리를 책임지고자 하는데 우리 지역에서 옥수수나 유채가 GM이 발생이 됐다. 이것은 굉장히 심각한 문제이고 지자체에서는 이것에 대해서 명백한 조사를 해달라. 그래서 안전관리를 해야 된다라는 민원 청구를 해놨는데 그런 개별 여성 농민의 이름으로 했습니다. 근데 만약에 그게 받아들여지지 않는다면 저희들은 행정소송도 진행할 계획입니다. 올해 열심히 사실 저희가 GMO 표시제 관련해서 활동을 했습니다. 표시제의 중요한 내용은 여기도 나와 있지만 시약처에서는 식품 성인한 모든 유전자 제조업 농산물 성인이 됐다는 것은 아까 전에 식용과 사료용을 말하는 것입니다. 얘기하는 것이고 여기 밑에 보시면 유전자 제조업 표시 대상 농산물을 주 원료로 사용하여 제조 가공 후 유전자 제조업 DNA 또는 외래 단백질 남아있는 식품 원료 함량 상위 6순위 이내라고 되어 있는데 저희들은 이것이 맞지 않다라고 보고 주 원료와 상관없이 모든 GMO 원료가 들어가 있다면 표시를 해야 된다는 것으로 좀 저희들은 주장을 하고 있습니다. 그리고 비의도적 혼입률 역시도 지금 3% 이내로 얘기를 하고 있는데 0.1%까지 낮아지지는 않더라 해도 EU 수준의 0.9% 정도까지는 되어야 되는 거 아니냐. 왜냐하면 비의도적 혼입률이라는 것은 소비자들이 받아들 때는 거기에는 GM이 안 들어있다라고 생각을 하는 거거든요. 그러면은 0%에 가까워야 되는데 3%냐 5%라는 그것은 크게 의미가 없다라고 생각하고 0%에 가깝게 해야 되는데 정말 의도하지 않고 전혀 생각지도 못했는데 삽입이 될 정도라면 0.1% 수준이어야 되지 않냐는 주장입니다. 그것이 되지 않는다면 EU 수준의 0.9% 정도라도 해야 되지 않는다는 주장을 하고 있습니다. 아시겠지만 식품 첨가물도 그렇고 GM도 그렇고 나한 GM의 경우에는 굉장히 큰 표시를 하고 GM이 들어있는 경우에는 소비자가 알아챌 수 없을 만큼 조그맣게 표시를 하거나 거의 표시가 안 되고 있는 지금 표시제 현황을 말씀드리는 내용입니다. 어쨌든 올해 저희가 국회에서도 많은 의원들이 개정 발의를 하고 있고 시민사회단체에서도 열심히 좀 활동을 하면서 올해 표시제에 대한 좀 여론이 많이 형성이 되었습니다. 그리고 5월달에 미국 오리건주에서 미승인 벼가 발견됨으로써 특히나 오리건주의 밀은 저희가 또 수입을 굉장히 많이 했던 밀이기도 하고 굉장히 국민적 여론이 일어났기 때문에 올해 반드시 표시제 개정이 될 수 있도록 마지막까지 저희들 좀 힘을 모아야 되지 않겠나 싶습니다. 저희가 함께하고 있는 유전자 조작 식품 반대 생명운동 연대는 농민단체와 시민사회단체 그리고 소비자 생협까지 해서 17개 단체가 함께 활동을 하고 있습니다. 제가 거기서 집행위원장을 맡고 있는데 여태까지는 사실은 사안별로 좀 결합을 했더라면 올해부터는 좀 더 체계를 갖추고 지속적 일상적 활동을 하기 위해서 좀 노력을 하고 있습니다. 사업 목표는 좀 참고를 해서 보시면 될 것 같습니다. 올해 구체적으로 활동했던 내용을 좀 보시면 국회와 경실련 그리고 생명운동연대에서 함께 소비자의 알뜰을 위한 유전자 변형 표시제 개설을 위한 공개 간담회를 진행했습니다. 그래서 지금은 식약처와 함께 식약처에서는 유전자 제조합이라는 용어를 사용했습니다. 근데 지금 정도에서는 용어 통일을 좀 해낸 수준이 유전자 변형, 저희는 유전자 조작이라고 주장을 하고 있습니다. 네, 이제 식약처의 유전자 제조합과 저희들의 유전자 조작과 그 중간 치쯤 되는 유전자 변형이라는 용어 통일을 오래 했고 고시가 아마 이렇게 될 것으로 생각됩니다. 17개 소속 단체에서 이 여론을 한 번 더 환기시키기 위해서 본인들이 직접 돈을 내서 선언운동을 진행했습니다. 이것을 일간지에 전면 광고를 내면서 4,000명이 넘는 소비자와 생산자가 함께 표시제를 위한 선언운동을 진행했습니다. 또한 아까 전에도 말씀드렸는데 8월달 한 달 동안 선언운동 이후에 10만 서명운동을 전개했습니다. 그래 한 달 동안이라는 짧은 기간에 온오프라인에서 서명운동을 진행했는데 이것이 한 8만 명 정도가 취합이 됐습니다. 그래서 이것을 보건복지위원회에 전달을 했습니다. 그래서 보건복지위원장으로부터 적극적으로 이것을 보건복지위원회 내에서 함께 하겠다라는 답변을 들었습니다. 표시제 개정을 위해서 이제 서명운동을 진행하고 나서 이것을 복지위원장한테 전달하기 전에 저희들이 서명 취합한 것과 앞으로의 활동 계획에 관해서 기자회견을 진행하고 전달하였습니다. 미국에서 여러 가지 캠페인이 있었는데 저희도 올해 5월달에 전 세계 몬산토 반대 행진의 날이 있었습니다. 그때 5월 25일날 함께 전 세계 60개국에서 했는데 저희도 이 반대 행진에 함께 했습니다. 그리고 올해 그 10월달에 슬로푸드 국제대회가 있었죠. 그때 함께 부스를 운영하면서 굉장히 많은 그 소비자들이 참석을 했었는데 이때 GMO에 대한 홍보를 함께 진행을 했습니다. 사실 여성 농민들이 진행하고 있는 토종농장 이야기를 좀 많이 해야 되는데 GMO에 대한 이야기를 좀 앞에 안내를 하려다 보니까 제 이야기가 좀 뒤로 밀리는 생각이 좀 듭니다. 여성 농민들은 이러한 GMO에 대한 구체적 대안으로 토종농장 시키기 사업을 시작하고 있습니다. 2005년도부터 이 사업을 진행했고 이미 다 사라지고 없을 거라는 그리고 토종의 가치를 너무나 인정하지 않는 이 상황에서 2005년도부터 토종농장 지키기를 시작했지만 지금 2013년 돌아보면 각 지금 지자체에서는 토종종자 보존 육성에 관한 지원 조례를 만들고 있습니다. 경남에서 이미 2008년도에 만들어졌고 전남, 제주 만들어졌습니다. 그리고 올해 전북에서 재정을 하기 위한 논의들을 시작했습니다. 저희들은 지역 구석구석을 찾아다니면서 실태조사를 진행하였고 토종종자를 찾아냈습니다. 이미 사라지고 없을 거라고 했지만 열심히 토종농사를 짓고 계신 아름다운 나이 드신 여성 농민들이 계셨습니다. 그분들이 돌아가시면 종자도 함께 사라지는데 돌아가시기 전에 저희들이 찾아낼 수 있었다고 생각합니다. 그리고 그것을 받아서 저희들이 체정포를 운영하면서 그것을 지금까지 지속적으로 지켜오고 있습니다. 토종종자는 사실은 여성 농민의 농사의 시작과 끝이라고 합니다. 그래서 농민들은 죽어도 종자를 베고 죽는다는 말이 있는데 그만큼 여성 농민들에게 씨앗은 굉장히 소중한 생산 수단이기도 합니다. 씨앗은 단순한 씨앗으로 끝나는 게 아니라 사실 식품으로 연결되는 부분이거든요. 몬산토를 비롯해서 많은 초국적 생명공학 기업들이 씨앗을 가져감으로 해서 씨앗만 가져간 게 아니라 전통농법에 대한 지식, 그리고 우리의 식문화, 우리의 모든 사회 문화, 음식에 관한 것까지 다 가져가 버렸다고 보여집니다. 그래서 저희가 토종농자를 지킨다는 것은 씨앗을 지키는 것과 전통 지식을 지키는 것과 전통 음식을 지키는 것과 문화를 지키는 것이라고 생각하고 있습니다. 이거는 한번 구체적으로 설명해야 될 것 같은데 저희가 이제 강원도 홍천에서 이렇게 굉장히 열심히 토종을 지키기 위해서 노력을 하고 있습니다. 여성 농민들만의 힘으로 자기 농사를 지으면서 따로 토종 농사를 짓는다는 게 쉽지가 않은데, 행복 중심 생협 우리 소비자들께서 함께 이렇게 토종 농사를 지어 주십니다. 작년에도 진행을 했고 올해도 진행을 했는데, 어쩔 때 정말 자기 일이 바빠서 최종법에 못 가볼 때도 있습니다. 그때 행복중심에서 오시면 할 수 없이 가서 제초제 쓰지 않으니까요. 직접 가서 풀을 뽑고 해야 되니까 소비자들이 오시면 함께 가서 힘들고 어렵지만 쉬고 싶지만 함께 가서 또 농사를 짓고 합니다. 그래서 1년을 소비자들과 함께 농사를 지으면서 소비자들도 토종의 소중함을 함께 배우는 훌륭한 교육의 장이 되었다고 생각합니다. 올해도 함께 그 사업을 진행했는데 이 자리를 위해서 한 번 더 고맙다는 말씀을 드리고 싶습니다. 네, 이것은 우리 제주 지역과 의성에서 열심히 토종 농사를 짓고 있는 우리 아름다운 여성 농민들의 모습입니다. 이렇게 토종 농사를 짓고 있는 여성 농민들에게는 저희가 이제 토종 지킴이증이라고 드립니다. 그러면은 한번 좀 가기 싫을 때 우리 토종 밭이 그래 있으면 안 되지 하는 마음으로 한 번 더 가서 또 손길을 주시라고 지킴이증을 드리면서 이곳은 토종 씨앗을 지키는 여성 농민들의 텃밭입니다라는 팻말도 같이 꽂아두고 있습니다. 이것은 저희가 이제 실태조사 다니면서 마을로 가정으로 또 시골 장터로 다니면서 실태조사를 하고 있는 모습입니다. 이렇게 많은 분들을 만나면서 토종을 찾다 보면은 단순하게 씨앗만 넣는 것이 아니라 씨앗에 담긴 사연도 함께 듣게 됩니다. 제가 어느 마을에 가서 얻게 된 어금니 돈부라는 게 있었습니다. 그 어금니 돈부를 처음에는 주시지 않았었습니다. 근데 제가 어느 마을에 왔다고 얘기를 하니까 그래 너희 마을과 우리 마을은 이런 관계가 있다. 이 관계 속에서 이 어금니 돈부가 어떤 역할을 했었다라는 얘기를 하면서 선뜻 그 어금니 돈부를 내주셨습니다. 저는 올해 46인데요. 그 어금니 돈부라는 걸 처음 봤었습니다. 그래서 이걸 어떻게 먹어야 됩니까? 라고 물으니 반미콩으로 먹으면 어떤 것보다도 맛있다. 밥맛이 났었습니다. 굉장히 맛있었고 그것이 사실은 그 사연이라는 게 저희 동네에서 6.25 때 피난을 갈 때 그 동네를 거치게 됐는데 우리 동네 사람들이 먹을 게 없어서 그 동네를 지나갈 때 그분들이 그 어금니 돈부로 인성을 나누었던 얘기를 하셨습니다. 그래서 제 시아버지 얘기를 들으면서 그분이 그런 사연을 이야기하시면서 그 씨앗을 주셨었거든요. 이런 씨앗 하나하나에 여성 농민들이 씨앗을 지키고 있는 데는 다 사연들이 있었습니다. 우리 아들이 이거 외에는 먹지 않는다. 그리고 이렇게 이 씨앗은 팔기 위해서 하는 게 아니라 원래 내가 먹던 것이기 때문에 우리 어머니 때부터 우리 아버지 때부터 쭉 먹어왔기 때문에 그냥 지을 뿐이다라는 얘기를 많이 해주십니다. 저희가 1년 동안 토종농사를 하고 나면 1년에 한 번씩 만나서 서로 농사 이야기를 합니다. 이 토종농사를 지으면서 어떤 일들이 있었고 이렇게 힘들었고 이런 즐거움들이 있었다. 그러면서 너도 한번 심어봐라 나도 한번 심어보자라고 얘기하면서 서로 나누고 또 그 토종씨앗으로 만든 음식들을 가져와서 나눠 먹는 자리를 합니다. 여러분을 오늘 한 번 더 초대하고 싶습니다. 이때까지 행사가 생산자끼리의 교류 행사였다면 저희가 11월 16일 날은 가락시장에서 소비자들과 함께 하는 토종이 있는 언니네 텃밭 추수한 마당을 크게 해보려고 합니다. 그때 함께 오셔서 토종 이야기와 함께 우리 전통 먹을거리에 대한 이야기를 함께 나눌 수 있었으면 좋겠습니다. 마지막으로 제가 드리고 싶은 말씀은 여성 농민들이 2005년부터 지금까지 토종농사를 지키고 있다는 것은 그것에 대한 믿음이 있었기 때문입니다. 종자권을 빼앗기고는 농사는 끝이라고 생각하고 있고 종자로부터 농사는 시작한다고 생각하고 있습니다. 기업이 자본의 힘으로 아무리 농민들을 농지에서 하고 있고요. 그래서 GMO 반대 운동을 하는 그 시작도 토종으로부터 저희들은 출발하고 있다고 생각합니다. 그래서 저희가 밟고 있는 농토에서 토종을 지키는 그 마음으로 반GMO 운동을 열심히 할 수 있도록 그렇게 하겠습니다. 고맙습니다.
수고하셨습니다. 수고하셨습니다. 저도 아버님 어머님이 농사를 짓는데 씨앗의 소중함을 어려서부터 많이 봤습니다. 씨앗을 준비하는 것들은 특별히 탈곡할 때도 조심해서 하고 햇볕에 잘 말려서 그 다음에 농사를 위해서 애쓰시는 모습을 보았습니다. 오늘 얘기를 들으니까 너무 아주 소중한 얘기였고요. 어머니들이니까 아마 계속 그 소중함을 이어오지 않았나 생각합니다. 너무 감사드리고요. 지금 이 시간은 질의응답 시간입니다. 질의응답은 혹시 질문이 있으시면 손을 들어주시면 저희 마이크를 갖다 드리도록 하겠습니다. 질문 있으신 분들 질문을 시작해 주시기 바라겠습니다. 강연이 너무 잘 돼서 아직 질문이 직접 카메라 좀 예.
이제 GMO가 이제 사실 미국에서 많이 자리를 잡았잖아요. 그 회사들이 뭐 유럽에 있는 회사들도 미국에서 이전해가지고 막 자리 잡고 그런 식으로 했는데 사실 GMO만 미국에서 주도적으로 하는 미국에 기반된 다국적 기업들이 미국에다가 자리를 잡아서 하는 게 그런 기업들이 GMO만 있는 것이 아니고 다른 분야들도 전반적으로 다 그런 식으로 GMO 회사들처럼 그런 식으로 많이 진행하고 있는 그런 다양한 이슈들이 많이 있는데요. 뭐 어떻게 보면은 민주주의적이고 가장 자유를 상징하는 그런 나라임에도 불구하고 그런 오히려 국민들의 주권이 자본에 의해서 이렇게 망가지는 그런 약탈당하는 그런 상황을 지금 가고 있는데 그럼에도 불구하고 사실 많은 미국인들이 아직도 미국에 대한 애국심도 굉장히 강한 사람들이고 그런데 정말 궁금한 게 그러한 다국적 기업들이 궁극적으로 바라는 것이 뭔지 정확하게 잘 모르겠습니다. 사실 단순히 기업으로서의 어떤 이윤 추구라기 보기에는 너무 좀 황당한 그런 짓을 하고 있는 건데 그거 이면에 어떤 또 다른 목적이 있는 것 같고요. 그게 뭔지 정말 궁극적으로 인간이 정말 어디까지 욕심이 어디까지 갈 수 있는가 뭐 이런 인간적인 차원에서 어떻게 좀 이해를 할 수 있는 부분들이 있는 건지 그리고 그 사람들이 몬산토나 신젠타 같은 회사들의 어떤 사장님들이 어떤 음식을 먹는지도 좀 궁금하고요. 그분들의 어떤 사상과 어떤 철학과 이런 것들이 사실은 무엇인지 정말 베일을 좀 벗어야 된다고 생각하거든요. 실체를. 이윤 추구나 시장 독점 이런 것보다 더 큰 목적이 있지 않나 이렇게 생각이 드는데 그런 부분들에 대해서 좀 얘기를 좀 듣고 싶습니다.
Well, is it on? How do you turn it on? Hello? No? Can they hear me? Maybe I should take this one. Actually, that's a very good question. I would point out that what these corporations want, besides profits, is they would like to control the food system. Because food is something that everybody has to eat. And I think what's most important here is the intellectual property. Because the U.S. was the only country in the world that allowed these industrial patents on living things. We started it in 1985, is when we first allowed patents on higher organisms. It wasn't until the World Trade Organization was set up in 1996 that the rest of the world had to go along with this, because WTO, the most important thing from the viewpoint of the U.S., or from the viewpoint, I should say, of not only the pesticide companies and the biotech companies like Monsanto, but also the pharmaceutical companies and the computer companies, is they wanted what's called trade-related intellectual property rights. And when this happens, you start to see these corporations buying out all the seed companies. These seed companies were all local. if we look right now, as of today, the top 3 seed companies in the world, number one is Monsanto, number 2 is DuPont Pioneer, number 3 is Syngenta. These 3 companies control 53.7% of the world's food supply. So this is about trying to control food and agriculture and make money from it. In terms of what they eat, I think many of them think that these foods are perfectly fine, although I would point out that many of the leaders don't necessarily eat them. I know at the Monsanto headquarters in London, for example, they don't serve GMOs in the cafeteria. The person that runs DuPont, the grandson that's now running it, he only eats organic food. And yet, he has a company that sells all these pesticides. So I think what's behind it is, one, is the simple profit motive. And if you can control the food supply, food is something that everybody has to eat. And if you can make money off of that, if you can force farmers to have to buy seed from you every year, that's a great business model. Some of us would say that that's not particularly ethical. And in fact, besides the peasants fighting this, there's a global movement to say that there should be no patents allowed on life forms. And in fact, in the United States, we had a Supreme Court decision over the BRCA gene. This was one of the genes that's involved in breast cancer. And there was a company that determined its sequence, and they literally wanted to tell every doctor, if you wanted to test your women patients whether they might be susceptible to breast cancer, there was a company saying, you can't do that unless you first pay us $300 to $500 US. What the Supreme Court did is they invalidated that patent, and they said you cannot get patents on genes. They left open the possibility of getting these patents on genes that are engineered into plants, into crops, because they are modified. Although I would argue that the modification you have to do before you insert it into a plant is so minor that that would not be considered a new invention. That would be, any scientist could do that. And so there is a possibility in the United States is that, given this one court ruling, it might be possible to try to go back and say that engineered crops shouldn't be patented. And if that can happen, then that's the only reason that these biotech companies have bought up all these seed companies and are trying to control things. It does have to do with that profit motive. And so if we can stop the patents, that will have a big impact. So I think this was all about, for these companies, it's about making money. And it's not ironic to me that most of these companies, they're also companies that sell pesticides. And the vast majority of the market, 85% of the global market in these engineered crops, are in herbicide-tolerant ones. They're designed to sell more of a company's proprietary chemicals. So that's why they're doing that. They want to make money off the food that you eat, and then they want to make money off of the chemicals that are put on those. So that's just the market mentality they have. Some of us think that that's unethical behavior, and that's why they have to be controlled. That's why we think there should be no patents on life forms, and I would like to say that I think that what the peasant movement here is doing is actually a very good thing. Other questions?
예, 선생님, 마이크.
Let me ask a question in English if the translation is okay. I study international affairs and international trade, and I was too lazy to do close research about the Monsanto. Thank you for your presentation, that's why. And you talked about the Washington. They more support the food labeling bills compared to California. So is there any background, environmental background, why Californian people doesn't really support the bill more than Washington citizens?
Well, I think what happened, part of the problem in California was the way, part of the problem is our side, we had to tell the truth. The other side didn't have to do that. They could make up any lies they wanted. And so what they did is, the ironic thing is they did focus groups in California, and they found that actually the arguments that worked the best in California for people to oppose Proposition 37 was not that they didn't want labeling, but that bill wasn't strong enough. Because there were exemptions. There were exemptions for example, for food that you take out from a restaurant, that you eat at a restaurant, or that you take out for food. There was an exemption if engineered grains are fed to an animal. The animal doesn't get labeled. And so that's what the opposition did, is even though they didn't want this labeling, their whole argument was, well, this bill has so many loopholes. It wouldn't label all these other things, and they should all be labeled. And in fact, surveys done after Proposition 37 was over found that 20% of the people that voted no on Proposition 37 was because they thought it should be stronger. So the opposition was very effective with seeing that they didn't want this at all, but as I said, their focus group showed people wanted something stronger. So that's why they used that argument, and they put all these false ads on TV saying that, for example, there was a bill, there was an ad that said this will lead to $400 a year more in food costs. Well, when you looked at that study carefully, that study was highly biased, because what it said is, if this bill passes, that immediately every engineered ingredient that's in a processed food would immediately be substituted with an organic ingredient. That's how they got the $400, that it would cost $400 per family per year. And that, of course, is an absurd assumption. If you would have just looked at how much it would cost a family of 3 for a year just to put the labels on, turns out it's less than $10. So part of what was happening in California is when you have a lot of money, you can put out a lot of disinformation. And that's what they were doing. That's why Consumers Union, even though I helped behind the scenes with the writing of the initiative and doing that, we didn't formally support it. Because our office in California says the problem with ballot initiatives is it's all dependent on how much money you put in. If you can get people to vote against anything if you put enough money into it, because they can run ads and all these things that turn out to be misleading. And in fact, there were ads from mailings from people that were that they said Democratic governors and that were against us. These were all completely false, but they still got sent out anyway. All these front groups saying, we oppose labeling, and they would say, we're from the Democratic governors of this or this union group, and those were all just completely made up. So that's why part of the problem with these ballot initiatives is our side we can only tell the truth. If we say something that is wrong, what happens is you're smeared in the media for basically saying a falsehood. The other side, they can say whatever they want, regardless of how true or not it is. Any other questions?
예, 다른 질문 한 분만 받도록 하겠습니다. 시간이 좀 많지 않아서요. 예.
그 미국의 그 소비자 연맹의 활동들을 들으니까 참 많이 뭐랄까 실제로 법안을 통과하기 위해서 그 소비자들이 그렇게 많은 그 서명을 조직해내고 그리고 기금을 모은다는 것 자체가 상당하다라는 좀 부럽다 그런 생각이 들기도 하는데요. 제가 알기로는 GMO 관련해서 처음에 미국의 경우에는 그 농민들이 실질적으로 그 유전자 조작 종자를 심지 않았음에도, 그러니까 유기 재배를 함에도 불구하고 그 이웃한 곳에서 그 종자가 오염되는 그런 것 때문에 소송도 하고 실제로는 소송에서 지는 경우들도 많이 있었는데, 그 소농들이 그거에 대한 저항 운동들이 많이 있었던 걸로 알고 있거든요. 그래서 그 이후에 농민들은 어떤 그 노력들을 하고 있는지에 대해서 궁금하고요. 또 한 가지는 저희 한국에서도 이 GMO의 그 위험성을, 그 생태적인 문제나 안전성 문제를 이야기할 때 항상 이것을 집행하려고 하는 사람들은 그 근거로 미국의 FDA가 이것을 그 안전성을 검증했다, 이런 표현들을 많이 하거든요. 그래서 이런 마찬가지로 미국에서도 선생님 같은 경우에도 처음에 그 FDA에서 그런 그 차이점을 발견했음에도 불구하고 그것에 대해서 점검하지 않는 그런 좀 잘못된 태도에 대해서 지적을 하셨는데, 그러면 이런 FDA가 국민의 안전성을 책임지지 못하면서 그것을 마치 책임지는 것처럼 하는 것에 대해서 좀 그런 거에 대해서 어떤 대응을 하는 것이 있는지, 그런 것에 대해서 궁금합니다.
Those are very good questions. That's a very good that's a very good question, because it is true outside the U.S. our trade ambassadors try to say that the FDA has determined these foods to be very safe. That is simply not true. In terms of the farmers, they've gotten more and more concerned with this contamination issue because they're getting their crops are increasingly being rejected. There's not only this case of the Roundup Ready wheat that was found, but there was also a case just last month in Washington State where farmers were planting non-engineered alfalfa. They bought conventional alfalfa, they planted it. Most of the alfalfa that gets harvested, a lot of it actually gets shipped to the Middle East. Well, it turns out testing determined that there was engineered trait in there, and so that alfalfa crop has now, that farmer who was transitioned to organic has now just lost his crop because of that. So that's led to actually a lot of farmers now are trying to plant non-engineered soybeans and corn, but the problem is they can't find it in the marketplace. Because the issue is since the biotech companies have bought up the seed companies, if you want the best genetics for your area, you often have to buy it as an engineered crop. And I'll end with one example. If we look at soybeans, Monsanto developed a soybean that was called Vistiv Gold. And those were high linolenic acids and high oleic acid soybeans. And what that means is the oil that you make from those soybeans is a non-trans fat. Normally, oil from soybeans, when you partially hydrogenate it, is a trans fat. So, of course, every farmer wants to grow soybeans that gives non-trans fat oils. That trait, the non-trans fat oil, that was developed via conventional breeding. But if you want that trait, the only way you can buy it in the United States is it has to be bought in a Roundup Ready variety. So that means farmers aren't being given the choice. And so that's why there's this concern about the control that these chemical companies have over the seed companies, because farmers aren't having a choice of the kinds of seeds they can plant. And so there's now a push in the United States to actually, farmers want to move to non-engineered soybeans because that's more what the market wants, but there's hardly any for sale. So that's you're starting to see a growing movement there, but more farmers are complaining about this, particularly in soybeans and corn.
예, 짧게 교수님. 예. 마이크 좀 부탁드리겠습니다.
오케이. 이제 한국 상황에 대해서 30초만 말씀드리겠는데 마이클 한센을 모셔다가 우리가 1986 처음으로 이제 소시모가 마이클 한센하고 GMO에 대한 문제 제기를 했고요. 지금 이제 소비자 단체 현황이 좀 딱하게 됐는데 소시모하고 YMCA는 분명하게 GMO를 반대하는 입장을 하고 있고 한 단체는 세모 이쪽으로 갔다 저쪽으로 갔다 하고 한국 소비자 연맹은 GMO를 지금 프로모션하는 거고 서협에 10개 단체가 있는데 지금 나왔잖아요. 하나는 강하게 찬성하고 하나는 강하게 반대하고 둘은 이제 강하게 반대하고 하나는 세모고 그러니까 이게 한 목소리를 내야 되는데 소비자 쪽에서 한 목소리를 내기는 어렵고 미국 FDA나 한국 FDA나 마찬가지인데 지금 한국의 식약청은 파이낸셜 서포트를 이 프로모션 하는데 소비자 연맹에게 교육 기금을 주고 있기 때문에 매년 GMO는 안전하다 하고 있고 소시모 같은 데서는 자금 없이 그냥 기회가 있으면 이것은 이러이러한 4가지 점에서 문제가 있다 하는 그렇게 하고 있죠. 그런데 다행인 것은 제가 오늘 여기까지 쫓아온 것은 이제 소비자 단체가 하다가 시민단체하고 경실련도 이제 강하게 우리하고 같이 이걸 하다가 지금 소비자 협동조합이 그러니까 생활협동조합이 이것을 맡아서 한다 하는 것은 한국에서도 이걸 강하게 반대할 수 있는 기틀이 마련됐구나 하는 점에서 대단히 반갑습니다. 땡큐.
네, 감사합니다. 네, 마지막으로 마이클 한센 선생님께서 마무리 인사 좀 부탁드리겠습니다.
I guess the only concluding remarks I would make is I thank everyone for the questions that have been asked, and I would also like to thank Meek Young Kim, because I think that was a wonderful presentation. I'm very glad to hear that the women farmers that are taking such strong actions. And I will just point out that in a lot of the activism I've done on this issue, it does appear to me that women are stronger on this issue than men. All the groups I work with in Asia are often run by women. The organization I work with, my boss and all the other people in my office are women as well. So I guess my final words here are just to say it looks like things are moving in a positive direction in the US on labeling. And even though there's a lot of pressure coming from the large companies, I think what they're moving now more toward is they're trying to say that these engineered crops are going to help in climate change. There's some pushback from that. We don't think that's the case. But I do think what's happening is that genetic engineering isn't really working. And behind the scenes, the companies are actually moving away from genetic engineering to some of these other molecular biology techniques. And I guess I would end by saying that I think that I would urge the movements here to get stronger, to strengthen your labeling laws, and to actually educate people as to what's happening in other countries like the United States. Because whenever I travel, I find that most people tend to think that our government has said that these foods are all safe, and the fact of the matter is that's not true. So that means all of us, at least in the US, for those of us that don't eat organic, we're guinea pigs involved in a large experiment. And that's why you need labeling here, unless you want to be part of this experiment. So I guess I'll end there. Thank you.
네, 감사합니다. 질문 사항이나 궁금한 사항들이 많으실 텐데 내일 11월 7일 내일 여성 플라자에서 10시부터 미국의 GMO 현황과 건강 영양이라는 주제로 또 강의가 있으십니다. 원하시는 분은 내일 질문 계속 하고 싶으신 분이나 원하시는 분들은 내일 서울 플라자로 가시면 될 것 같고요. GMO로부터 안전한 밥상을 차리기 위해서 우리 모두가 함께 노력해 갔으면 좋겠습니다. 오늘 GMO 세션 모두 마치도록 하겠습니다. 모두 박수로, 큰 박수로 마치겠습니다. 수고하셨습니다.
삼성에서 떡 장사도 하나요?
아, 아니요. 저희는 그 대기업 삼성이랑 관련이 전혀 없고요. 앞에 법인이 삼성이 붙어서 앞에 두 글자를 삼성을 붙이게 되겠습니다. 네.
왜 법인으로 삼성으로 했어요?
처음 시작했을 때 천주교 재단이었는데 저희가 그 삼성이란 뜻이 성부, 성자, 성령의 그 세 개의 성을 가리켜서 삼성이란 이름으로 지었다고 지었습니다. 네.
떡값.
네.
떡값도
네.
주겠네요.
떡값?
떡값.
네.
떡껌
네.
만든 거 아니야?